Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. Can Ukraine push back the Russians, or is Zelensky just delaying the inevitable? This seems to be at least part of the subtext of these conversations about what America should do. Should we engage in some sort of Lend-Lease program with the Poles to get fighters to the Ukrainians? Should we ban importation of Russian oil? Part of this is an assessment on who's likely to be victorious, or is there a path to victory, meaning pushing the Russians back to Russia? Is there a path for the Ukrainians? Some divided opinion on that on the Sunday talkies, of course. Former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, William Taylor, on CNN, had this to say.
Russians can stop Pam. Russians can stop President Putin. That is, there are people around him who must be worried about his mental state. There are thousands of Russians in the street. If those get to be millions in the street, the Russians can stop him. The Ukrainian military is effectively stopping him in certain places. They're not in the south, but they certainly are around Kyiv. 10 days. President Putin undoubtedly thought, like a lot of intelligence around the world, thought that in 3 days his military could be in Kyiv. It's 10 days. Mm-hmm. It's 10 days. He underestimated Ukraine. He underestimated President Zelensky. He underestimated the unity of the NATO alliance and the ability of the American administration to pull this all together.
Yeah, and that's a statement you hear a lot. Okay, I mean, let's say maybe he did underestimate both the West as well as Zelensky and the Ukrainians. Is that a fatal underestimation is the question. Does it change the outcome or just the timeline to get to that outcome? For a contrary assessment, as he's been giving to much criticism, Colonel Doug McGregor on Fox suggesting that Zelensky is just delaying the inevitable and actually suggesting worse about Zelensky.
The first 5 days, Russian forces, I think, frankly, were too gentle. They've now corrected that. So I would say another 10 days, this should be completely over. But the question is, what is it that Zelensky is going to do? The Russians have made it very clear what they want is a neutral Ukraine. This could have ended days ago if he accepted that. And then they can adjust the borders. But the eastern part of Ukraine is firmly in Russian hands. But again, the Russians are not seizing territory. They're destroying Ukrainian forces. That's their focus.
And his characterization of Zelensky, which surprised Stuart Varney in this back and forth.
Oh, I think Zelensky is a puppet. And he is putting huge numbers of his own population at unnecessary risk. And quite frankly, most of what comes out of Ukraine is debunked as lies within 24 to 48 hours. The notions of taking and retaking airfields, all of this is nonsense. It hasn't happened.
He's not a hero when he's standing up for himself and his own people. You don't think he's a hero?
No, I do not. I don't see anything heroic about the man. And I think the most heroic thing that he can do right now is to come to terms with reality. Neutralize Ukraine. This is not a bad thing. A neutral Ukraine would be good for us as well as for Russia. It would create the buffer that, frankly, both sides want. But he's, I think, being told to hang on and try to drag this out, which is tragic for the people that have to live through this.
For an adjudication of these disagreements, we're pleased to be joined by Lieutenant Colonel Jim Carafano for our weekly confab, Vice President of the Catherine and Shelby Cullom Davis Institute for International Studies at the Heritage Foundation, and author of Brutal War, Jungle Fighting in Papua New Guinea, 1942. Jim, thanks for joining us.
Hey, good to be with you. So, truth's probably somewhere in the middle. First of all, let's debunk the nonsense that this is about a neutral Ukraine. You don't invade countries, blow up their cities, because you're just interested in protecting your borders. Putin currently not only occupies part of Ukraine, occupies part of Moldova and Georgia, also independent countries. He's done everything possible to undermine NATO allies, all kinds of nefarious things and disinformation, including my favorite, which is funding NGOs in Europe to protest against energy projects that compete with Russian energy projects. So the notion that somehow this is just about neutralizing Ukraine there's no evidence for that. There's none whatsoever. I mean, actually, Putin's been pretty clear that his objective is to reabsorb all the post-Soviet states, to have dictatorial control over Central Europe, to have NATO dissolve, and to have the United States withdraw and be isolated. I mean, these are factual things. So this notion that somehow that the Ukrainians are being unreasonable because their country was invaded illegally, and because they're being subjected to literally war crimes, I just don't think that credibility. The flip side of that is, look, if we just look at the force ratios, even with all the missteps and faults of the Russians, it's very, very difficult to conceptualize how the Ukrainians could defend their country over the long term. Having said that, once you unleash the dogs of war, you never know who they're going to bite. So as somebody that was in the military for 25 years and has studied a lot of military history, predicting exactly how this is going to turn out, I would do that. But it is factually correct to say the Ukrainians are fighting way harder than the Russians anticipated. The Russians thought the whole campaign was going to be over in 15 days, and that would include the military dissolving literally in the early days, the government being decapitated, and there being essentially a painless occupation. None of that's played out for the Russians.
So what about two proposals that are being bandied about inside the Beltway, as you know? Ban the importation of Russian oil, enforce a no-fly zone in Ukraine, close the skies, as the chant goes.
Well, first of all, it's not just about, we have lots of things on the table here. One is banning Russian oil. The other is this administration actually reaching out to Venezuela to import in Venezuelan oil, which is heavier and dirtier, and actually is, again, kind of a backdoor into the Russians and the Chinese. And then there's this talk of doing an Iran deal and importing Iranian oil. And this is complete nonsense, because an Iran deal essentially would give Russia a backdoor into the global economy to bypass all the Russian sanctions. And of course, the Iranians would use all their cash to buy weapons from the Russians, which would enrich Putin, and would allow Iran to be a much more grave military threat in the Middle East. So we can't have one-off conversations. This notion, let's ban Russian oil. Well, if we're banning Russian oil and we're buying Iranian and Venezuelan oil, are we better off?
And Saudi.
I'm okay with Saudi oil, but look, and the other thing is discussion about cutting off foreign oil supplies that aren't paired with discussions about increasing domestic production are just nonsense. So you have to do both. This is a package deal. And when I hear people say, let's cut off Russian oil, fine, but if that's not paired with immediately ramping up domestic production, that makes no sense.
Yeah, and that's why
a
barrel of oil is $130 right now. But what about the no-fly zone and closing the skies?
Yeah, I just think, I have on my staff a former F-16 pilot who actually commanded, I think, the Thunderbirds. I think that's the Air Force one. Had multiple tours in Western Europe. There's just no practical way for one to implement that. Two, it actually would make us a belligerent in the war, and I think that's risky. And the third is this is not an air war. And to me, this is the biggest thing. If people talk about a no-fly zone, this war is being fought out on the ground, and it's being fought with missiles and artillery and troops and mercenaries. So, having neutral skies doesn't actually solve the problem for Ukraine. And you say, well, the Ukrainian guys could fly. Well, if it's a no-fly zone, that means you wouldn't allow Ukrainians to fly either. And even if they could fly, this is one of the most deadly air defense zones in the world. The Ukrainians couldn't conduct an air campaign against the Russians and survive very long. So I think it's one of these things that sounds great in theory, and it's even been proposed by former senior U.S. officials, but the practicality of it doesn't really work, and it wouldn't be a game changer in the war or in the protection of civilians, because planes aren't killing civilians. What's killing civilians is artillery and missiles and machine guns and bombs.
Speaking of game changers, so There is a Vietnam vet who wrote this piece for American Thinker about missiles that we could be providing the Ukrainians that he suggests would be a game changer to do things like take out that 40-mile Russian convoy. And so the question is, are there game-changing weapons, artillery that we can provide the Ukrainians? He talks about this missile called a BBAM, M39A1
Right.
missile. Is that something that should be under discussion?
I'm all for providing the Ukrainians any military capabilities that available to allow them to defend their country. I'm all for that. So I will raise this issue because it is a real issue. If the Russians bog down, will they use chemical weapons, which they green-lighted the Syrians doing that in Syria, or will they use tactical nuclear weapons, which is in their doctrine, that if you cannot achieve your objectives with conventional forces, that the first offensive use of nuclear weapons is permissible. I don't know. I know that's in their doctrine. I'm not suggesting that the Ukrainians stop fighting because the Russians may escalate, but you cannot fight a war and take off the table enemy actions that you think are unthinkable just because you don't want to think about them.
Okay, fair point.
Well,
On that point of nuclear, has Zelensky been straight, or do you think, with the West in terms of the red alert on Chernobyl and then the red alert on this nuclear plant at Zaporizhzhia, suggesting that it's the entire world's problem now because the Russians were potentially going to trigger a nuclear event at one of those reactor sites? Is that, and that's not, of course, what has happened. But
Right.
is that misinformation by Zelensky to try and whip the West into this fight, or that's just an understandable belief based on what Russia is capable of doing?
Yeah, I mean, in fairness to Zelensky, and I had a completely sleepless night trying to sort out fact and fiction when they shelled the plant. I mean, these are legitimate concerns. I mean, with these nuclear facilities, one of the things you have to continue to cool them, right? So even nuclear waste has to be cooled, right? And so not knowing the absolute conditions on the ground and inside the plant, not knowing the degree that damage might be, I mean, attacking a nuclear facility, I mean, this is the height of irresponsible. I mean, and who knows where that could have gone. I mean, if the fires had burned differently, or they, bond something. I mean, so those were incredibly dangerous situations. And if a catastrophic event had occurred, which is technically feasible under the right conditions, that would bleed over into other parts of Europe. I mean, this is also my concern with, even if chemical and nuclear weapons were employed and they were limited to the theater of operations in Ukraine, the effects of those things are going to bleed over into the rest of Europe, and the panic is going to be unbelievable. So that would be an incredibly provocative and dangerous situation. So Putin has launched a war that didn't go well, and on top of that, he has done some unbelievably unspeakable and provocatory acts. Things could really not be more dangerous.
well, do you think, though, that he would stop with Ukraine or try then to take over Poland or Romania or Moldova?
Well, first of all, I think because this campaign has been fairly debilitating, and because of the shocks to the Russian economy, I think regardless of how, and because the even if he partially occupies the country, it's going to be very, very difficult. We saw that yesterday with protests in the streets in areas where the Russians already are. He's in for some very heavy costs, and I think even if he's even moderately successful, there's going to have to be some kind of pause and regrouping. But he has got options. One is, go back to Moldova and Georgia. These are Moldova. I mean, there's a paved road into Moldova. It's a tiny country. I mean, they barely have a military. He could occupy Moldova in an hour and a half. I mean, Georgia's at risk. So he could proceed that way. Or he could go I doubt at this point he would go straight for the gold, but the plan eventually, I mean, look, it's absorb Moldova, Georgia, the Balkans. These are all areas that he can go. But at some point, what he wants to do, and they're very clear about this, is he'll go into just one European country, and it could actually be quite small. It could be one of the Baltic countries. And all he has to do is go into one NATO country and have NATO flinch and not trigger Article 5. And he would have proven that NATO is not real, that collective defense is not real. NATO would unravel. It would be everybody for themselves. And I keep reminding people, the number one beneficiary of this would be China, because nothing benefits China more than a weakened and divided Europe where they can step in. And an opportunity essentially to isolate the United States in a way that it hasn't been isolated since 1942. So I didn't use the word incredibly dangerous seriously. So I like to remind people that Ukraine is the crisis before the next crisis. It doesn't end here. And people think that this is just about adjusting borders in Ukraine to build a safe zone for Putin. That's just complete nonsense. This is the start of a march to a place which is very, very bad for the United States. And if we don't stiff arm that, we've already talked about the kinds of things, America has to be energy independent. We have to have a strong NATO conventional and strategic deterrence. And, most importantly, we have to figure out how to get our economy up and running, in ways everything that Biden talked about in the State of the Union address would be the opposite of what we need to do to get this economy up and running. And we have to have a global economy that's protected against the likes of Iran and Russia and China. This is a huge to-do list. And this list does not go away, regardless of how the Ukrainian war plays out.
I want to go back to Iran because concurrently there's these Iranian nuclear talks, and there was this statement made to a reporter by a Russian diplomat involved in these talks, Mikhail Ulyanov, who said this.
I'm absolutely sincere in this regard. Iran got much more than it could expect. Much more. Realistically speaking, Iran got more than, frankly, I expected, others expected. This is a matter of fact. Our Chinese friends were also very efficient and useful as co-negotiators.
So China, Iran, Russia are ecstatic about this pending nuclear deal. And now, is that agitprop, or are you as concerned that we haven't learned the lesson of appeasement of Putin when it comes to the mullahs in Tehran?
No, everybody who's been following this, I really respect. Essentially, the administration strategy is they've actually publicly acknowledged that they cannot do an Iran deal that will prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. So essentially, their strategy is a exact mirror image of the Obama strategy, which is they're going to bribe the Iranians into not being threatening. One, we know it's not going to work because it didn't work under Obama. Two, it's even more dangerous than it was under Obama because as you're trying to isolate Russia, an Iran deal literally is a wide open back door for Russia into the global economy. So literally the administration is undermining its own strategies. And then like I said, not only then turning to Iranian oil, which increases our dependence on foreign oil, but then going to Venezuela, which is a tool of the Russians and the Chinese, and flooding them with petrodollars to empower that dictatorship. As we're seeing a flood of dictators kind of pop up in Latin America, all of them with ties to China and Russia. This is madness. I don't use that word lightly. This administration, as if we abandoned the Cubans, we abandoned the Afghans, we've thrown the Ukrainians under the bus. Now we're going to set fire to the Middle East and empower dictators in Latin America. This is incredible. I've only been doing this stuff, my entire adult life, which is a real long time. I have never seen anything like this. He makes Jimmy Carter look like Bismarck. It is literally, everybody's light should be flashing red.
Lieutenant Colonel Jim Carafano, VP of the Catherine Shelby Cullen Davis Institute for International Studies at the Heritage Foundation. Thanks, Jim. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Saying it like it is, and he joined us on our turnkey.pro